Congress more effective and more efficient, so that as an institution, Congress can better serve the American people. Our committee staff have held ongoing listening sessions with House staffers in order to hear their ideas for improving and modernizing Congress, and Vice Chair Graves and I have done our best to talk to as many of our colleagues as possible to learn what they think Congress can do to function in a smarter way and a better way. And the problems we hear about are the same regardless of party or position. Members and staff across the board face the same challenges in trying to do their jobs as best as they can. And too often they're trying to solve 21st century problems using 20th century processes. Modernizing the workflow should be a priority. Concepts like bulk purchasing and competitive procurement are hardly cutting edge. Our counterparts in the executive branch and the private sector have figured out that purchasing 1,000 computers yields a better price than purchasing 10 computers. They've also figured out that centralizing commonly used services often makes good financial sense. Yet here in the House, members and staff are too often relying on outdated, inefficient processes and systems to do their jobs. And that shouldn't be the case. Like most of the issues in this committee's mandates, improving administrative efficiencies is totally inside baseball. This may come as a shock, but the nitty-gritty details of internal House operations doesn't exactly grab headlines. But it's incredibly important. Congress needs to keep pace with evolving administrative practices and adapt modern approaches to solving administrative challenges. This committee's guiding principle is to make Congress work better for the American people, and we view everything we do through that lens. And this hearing continues our tradition of doing the hard but necessary work of figuring out how to modernize this place. And I'm looking forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say about streamlining Congress's administrative functions, potential opportunities for cost savings, and best practices from other institutions. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the experts before us today. And I'd now like to invite our Vice Chair, Tom Graves, to share some opening remarks as well.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, before I begin, let me congratulate you and the rest of our committee on the extension of this committee for another year. We live to see another day, and the vote of the House yesterday is confidence clearly in what the committee has been doing. And we started this year with a commitment to bipartisanship and working in ways and looking at things outside of the box to make Congress work better for the American people. And I'm very pleased with the work we've done, and now we have another year in which to pursue more advances. We've got an opportunity to build upon this year's progress, this year's work, and delve a little deeper into some of the issues affecting the legislative branch. And one of those issues, as you have mentioned, is what we're going to discuss today, and that's ensuring that Congress is using its resources efficiently and effectively. As representatives, we're tasked with utilizing taxpayer dollars responsibly. And throughout the House, we have many opportunities to streamline operations and to identify ways that we can team up to cut costs and to save taxpayer dollars. Now, this can mean, as you were talking about earlier, about purchasing powers with our bulk purchasing opportunities, with the resources and programs, the many that we're purchasing on a regular basis, and removing technology costs from current member office budgets, as we proposed earlier in a round of recommendations. So I look forward to today's hearing and learning a little bit more today from our witnesses on ways that we can identify and update our practices and save some dollars and become a little bit more efficient and effective as an institution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations again on the extension.
Thank you. Today we welcome the testimony of our four witnesses. Our first witness is Mike Tischinsky. Did I get it? Stuck the landing. Who was appointed as the 5th Inspector General of the U.S. House of Representatives in 2018. Mr. Tischinsky previously served in the Office of Inspector General of the U.S. House of Representatives as the Deputy Inspector General of Advisory and Administrative Services and as the Director of Management Advisory Services. Prior to joining the House, Mr. Tischinsky spent over 15 years working in consulting and management roles in the financial services industry. Our next witness is Eric Peterson. Dr. Peterson is a specialist in American national government in the Government and Finance Division of the Congressional Research Service, where he's worked for 2 decades. He conducts research and provides policy analysis, support, and training for members of Congress and their staff. His research areas include congressional administration and staffing, constituent service management, congressional executive relations, the Government Publishing Office, and government information management, the Smithsonian Institution, and government contingency planning. Dr. Peterson earned an MA in Public Administration from Virginia Tech and an MA and PhD in Political Science from Syracuse University. We're also joined by Dr. Drew Willison, who formerly served as Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, where he was entrusted with the operations and security of the United States Senate and developed close personal and professional relationships with all 100 senators and their staffs. Mr. Willison has served at the highest levels of government for more than 20 years as staff director of the Senate Subcommittee on Energy and Water Appropriations, and most recently as chief of staff to the Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid. Among his many accomplishments, Mr. Willison was one of the principal architects of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, crafting the massive 2-year federal budget bill and successfully brokering its enactment with the White House and congressional leaders. He holds a master's degree in public administration from the Ohio State University and a law degree from George Washington University. Mr. Willison is currently a partner of Oldecker and Willison LLP. And our final witness is Teresa Gertzen, who was named president and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration in January of 2017. The Academy is an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan organization chartered by Congress to assist government leaders in building more effective, efficient, accountable, and transparent organizations. Ms. Curtin has nearly 12 years in the senior executive service as a career member and as a political appointee, and 20 years of service as an active duty Army officer. She has a broad range of experience in all aspects of public service management, and her expertise has been recognized with both the Distinguished and the Meritorious Presidential Rank Awards. Prior to joining the NAPA, Ms. Curtin served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy for the U.S. Department of Labor Veterans Employment and Training Service. Prior to joining the Department of Labor, Ms. Curtin spent 2 years as the Vice President at the Cohen Group, a Washington, D.C. consulting company, and before that she served for 8 years as a member of the Senior Executive Service in the Department of Defense. Ms. Curtin graduated from the United States Military Academy and earned an MBA from Duke University. She earned the Distinguished Presidential Rank Award in 2011 and the Meritorious Presidential Rank Award in 2008. She also received the Decoration for Exceptional Civilian Service in 2011. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Tischinsky, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the Select Committee, I'm honored to appear before you today in my capacity as Inspector General of the House. My office plays an important role in helping to ensure the integrity of House financial and administrative processes and identifying back office process improvement opportunities. Our focus is on the operations of the House. We spend our time working with the House officers and the Committee on House Administration, examining a variety of House functions and identifying risks that could adversely impact the institution. Members come to Congress to represent their constituents and legislate. When they arrive in Washington, they suddenly must hire staff and operate offices in D.C. and in their districts. As an individual employing authority, each member office is responsible for a wide range of general administrative functions that consume staff time and MRA resources. Each hour of staff time and dollar expended in support is a resource that could otherwise be utilized doing constituent or legislative work. This committee has already made a number of recommendations that deal with some of the items I will be discussing. I will focus on 3 areas that I believe would enable members and staff to devote more of their resources to legislating for the nation and helping constituents. The 3 topics are increasing financial administrative support, centralizing procurement for commodity items, and standardizing office technology and support. Members must manage their office finances and account for every MRA dollar that is spent. These details are accessible and transparent to the public via the quarterly statement of disbursements. It is important that spending is proper and that spending is properly recorded and reported. Achieving this is challenging given it requires a detailed understanding of the House's often complex rules, operational policies, and procedures. Travel expense reimbursement is one area that can be complicated and time-consuming. A way to reduce paperwork and the time spent preparing vouchers is to utilize a per diem model for meals and incidental expenses. The executive branch, through the General Services Administration, was authorized to establish and develop per diem processes in 1986, over 30 years ago. Rather than travelers collecting and itemizing receipts for each meal and incidental expense, executive branch workers are provided a flat, predetermined per diem allowance based on the travel destination. Per diems are also widely adopted by many other governments, higher education institutions, and private sector companies. The federal travel regulations outline policies and procedures that could be leveraged if the House wanted to consider this type of model. Another idea is to consider is expanding the services of the Office of Financial Counseling to more directly assist offices with financial management and voucher preparation. These tasks could be completed by centralized staff with the requisite knowledge and experience and whose sole responsibility would be providing offices with finance support. This would not only make it easier to ensure compliance with all the applicable rules, but also enable member office staff to focus on their core functions. Regular analysis of House spending can highlight opportunities to negotiate better pricing for offices and save the House and ultimately the taxpayers money. Negotiating House-wide contracts or purchasing services for all offices centrally rather than independently could save money. For example, today House offices have a great deal of latitude when purchasing IT equipment and support. While members and their staff may have differing and often strong preferences about the types of IT equipment that they should use, each office making these purchases independently comes at a price. There's a tremendous opportunity to reduce technology acquisition and support costs by establishing a small set of standard devices in key categories like computers, printers, copiers, and directing procurement through the Office of Acquisitions Management. Negotiating larger purchases with a smaller number of vendors would allow the House to leverage its buying power and reduce costs. Member offices also spend considerable MRA money to support IT. In some cases, the support services offered by the CAO and by contracted vendors significantly overlap. Strengthening the support provided by the CAO and ensuring it meets the needs of members could significantly reduce or eliminate having member offices pay for adjunct support. The question to consider is, would it be better if the House provided robust administrative and IT support to members just like office space, utilities, and furniture? As I stated at the beginning of my testimony, members come to the House to serve their constituents and to legislate. The House is a complex entity with many rules and policies that govern its operations. The current model puts significant administrative overhead on each member office. To address this, I think the House officers and officials can be better positioned to help members alleviate this burden. Mr. Chairman, my thank you to you, the Vice Chairman, and members of the Select Committee for letting me share some of my ideas. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks very much. Dr. Peterson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, sir. Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. You've asked me to address administrative efficiencies in the House, particularly changes in practices that might have resulted in member office efficiencies over the past decade, and along with some challenges to improving efficiency. As you know, CRS's role is to provide objective, nonpartisan research and analysis to Congress, and as such, CRS doesn't take a position on the desirability of any specific policy or practice. And in efficiency, the effort to produce the maximum output with available resources, while it's a foundational aspiration of value in many organizations, it can be tough. I mean, the promises of enhanced efficiency and clear measurable improvement over past efforts can serve as touchstones of organizational success. Indeed, the committee's investigational jurisdiction lists 5 organizational aspirations. Efficiency is the only one that's mentioned twice. In isolation, nobody doesn't like efficiency. The challenge is that, like most organizations, the House is limited in its ability to identify and track it. This is in part because efficiency can be hard to find, it may not readily be measured, and efficiency can look different to different people. So there may be disagreements about what constitutes an efficient process, state, or outcome. Efficiency is also only one of many aspirations in complex organizations like the House, along with accountability, effectiveness, responsiveness, or transparency. And in particular concern here in the House, 2 aspirations are arguably touch on every facet of chamber activity: representation and deliberation. There may be trade-offs among competing aspirations. One recent study that tried to rank public sector aspirations found that efficiency came in 12th among 20 organizational values. In addition to the internal competition between aspirations, institutional structures and practices have effects on the scope and extent of efficiency. In Congress, the long tradition of deference to members to determine their representational responsibilities, including how they run their offices, has long been privileged over arguably more efficient administrative processes. In addition to the examples that Mr. Tischinsky provided, House staffing does a really good job of demonstrating the tension between aspirations. There are 8,600 staffers working for member employing authorities. There are approximately 496 member positions in personal leadership and committee offices that hire staff. And as you know, each office is responsible for identifying, hiring, and establishing the duties and working conditions of staff independently. On its face, this appears to represent a substantial administrative burden that can be viewed as rife with inefficiency. A centralized human resource process, as discussed earlier in one of your committee's recommendations, might be a remedy, but because the House appears to value member autonomy and independence over efficiency, for more than 120 years, since personal staff were first hired here in the House, it's taken no action to remedy these apparent inefficiencies. In the past decade, and provided in detail in my longer statement, there have been a number of administrative efforts that could be seen to have improved the efficiency of House operations while arguably addressing other organizational demands or aspirations. Some observers argue that there are still opportunities to improve House administrative operations and efficiencies, and we've heard of a couple of these this morning. One other is, surrounding the idea of how to handle specialized staff who handle administrative or information technology services and operations within the chamber. Another is the use of government travel cards. But with those, and as with any existing administrative changes are introduced and evolved, they must be weighed against the context of how increased efficiency might affect other aspirations or institutional values, established processes, or the nature of the House. Any administrative proposal is likely to be considered from the perspective that the House is a place of representation and deliberation first, where members are typically granted broad discretion to carry out their official duties in the manner they deem most appropriate. I hope this has been of assistance. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Mr. Wilson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and members of the Select Committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I hope to share a variety of examples of efforts undertaken to upgrade and modernize the operations of the United States Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Organization. I spent the better part of 8 years as either the Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms or the Sergeant-at-Arms from 2007 until 2015. Just to note, the role of the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms is somewhat broader than the House Sergeant-at-Arms. The Senate Sergeant-at-Arms has responsibility for most of the non-legislative back-of-the-house operations in the Senate, which includes Senate-wide contracting authority, as well as all of the security operations that overlap with the House Sergeant-at-Arms. Total of 800 employees, a budget of a little over $200 million. First area I want to touch on this morning is information technology. In a perfect world in the Senate, all information technology, hardware, software, and security would be centrally procured, operated, maintained, and updated. As a general rule, the more far-flung the decision makers and the hardware, the more vulnerability there is. However, we don't live in a perfect world, so we always did the best we could given the demands of 100 highly particular bosses. So the way it worked is all IT procurement is actually done centrally through the Sergeant-at-Arms. As long as it meets specifications, members have a lot of flexibility in terms of what sort of systems they use, generally from an approved but exhaustive list. The centralization of these purchases saves the Senate and the members a lot of money for reasons that I think a couple of us have already discussed. 1,000 is better buying power than 100. 100 is better than 10. It also helps the Sergeant-at-Arms to ensure that all of the technology being deployed is up to current security standards, which reduces vulnerabilities to members' committees in the Senate. Where we have had a little less success and continue to have a little less success is in convincing members, and more specifically their staffs, to surrender a certain level of control over their networks and data. Most Senate offices, both member offices and committee offices, employ IT managers. They work internally and they run their networks and data and their systems relatively independently. In a perfect world, the Senate would not run several hundred separate networks and would allow for centralized operation of them. We work in an unusual environment up here. It's understandable up to a point in a political environment such as this that members would want to do it this way, but it is not a best practice, and it creates, particularly at the employee level, so many more additional points of vulnerability. Another IT example that I'm actually proud of, because I was sort of cradle to grave on this one, is our effort to drive up efficiencies up and costs down in the area of our still relatively new voice over internet protocol telephone system. Our phone system was bad for, it was too old, it had too many failures, it would crash when big issues came before the Senate, and the phone calls went up at a time when people actually called more than sent emails. So the easiest thing for us to do would have been to select a traditional telecom to just upgrade the existing system. However, we decided that a somewhat more expensive, at least initially, voice over internet protocol system made better sense and would more seamlessly integrate with our other systems. Not surprisingly, implementing a brand new system took a little longer than expected, actually a lot longer than expected, and ran over budget by a bit, which didn't make our authorizing committee nor our appropriators very happy. However, it turned out to be the right choice. The system works great. It doesn't crash when during high volumes, has far more features and works extremely well. I merely offer this up as an example of how significant change or modernization often comes with enhanced risks. They're calculated properly into the decision-making process. It makes it worth it to make the bigger leap. What I think is going to turn into my final example is another decision made out of absolute necessity regarding the printing, graphics, and direct mail department within the Sergeant at Arms. For decades, nearly all aspects of PGDM was done inside the Dirksen building, regardless of scope. A very labor-intensive process and had not kept up with an evolving digital world. We made the decision after months of back and forth with our Oversight Committee and the Appropriations Committee to invest nearly $10 million in an off-site printing facility. By making that investment, we were able to reduce printing, graphics, and direct mail staffing by 25%, and we're able to enter into a long-term lease in a much less expensive part of the metropolitan area out in Cheverly. And since then, we've been able to process and send member mail out substantially more quickly, and the new technology has allowed us to pre-sort mail for the U.S. Postal Service in a way that saves the Senate $1 million or more per year. For all intents and purposes, the capital investment after 7 years has already paid for itself through efficiencies and cost savings, and the Senate is completely out of the offset printing business. I've run over time a little bit, so I will save my scintillating example about state office leases for the round of questioning. If not, there's information in my written statement about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Willison. And last but not least, Ms. Curtin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I am a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and have served as its president and chief executive officer since January of 2017. Established in 1967 and chartered by Congress in 1984, the Academy is an independent, non-profit, and nonpartisan organization. We have a proven record of improving the quality, performance, and accountability of government at all levels. But despite being chartered by Congress, very little of the Academy's work over its 52-year history has centered on the examination of processes and structures within the legislative branch. Instead, the majority of the Academy's work, especially that portion of the work directed by Congress through statute and report language, has focused on the operations of various agencies across the executive branch. I'd like to highlight some insights from our recent work with the executive branch that may be applicable to the legislative branch, and a more comprehensive set of reports is referenced in my written statement. First, an Academy panel chaired by Professor Don Kettle recently completed 2 papers outlining a fundamentally new vision for the future of the federal civil service. These reports examined the impact of the changing nature of work on the civil service and concluded that without immediate and significant change, we all risk a federal workforce that is neither trained for, structured for, nor adaptable to the work that will be required of it, and the need for radical change is urgent. The report presents a new model of talent management that rests on 3 fundamental tenets: mission first, principles always, and accountability to both. In this space, Congress is in a unique position. As a separate branch of government, it has the autonomy we advocate for in the executive branch agencies to design its own human capital practices. A focus on mission first and principles always, combined with an understanding of modern talent management tools and practices, could strengthen the skills, development, and retention of the legislative branch workforce. Second, in 2015, the Academy examined the telework practices of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to ensure that management controls and programmatic goals were effective and aligned with the agency's mission. I recognize that telework is not immediately perceived as compatible with the day-to-day demands of congressional schedule and the type of work conducted by members' staff while in session. Nonetheless, workers today routinely list flexible work arrangements as a desired feature of their employment. As Congress considers options for modernization, the Academy panel's PTO report, especially recommendations for how managers and teleworking employees can establish productive working relationships, could be useful if you decide to increase flexibility in work arrangements through telework. Third, in partnership with ICF, the Academy conducted surveys in 2015 and 2016 of federal leaders to gain their perspectives about the pace with which the government is adopting, applying, and leveraging technological advancements in service to its constituencies. Although these reports focused on the executive branch, they do have implications for Congress. Key lessons learned include the importance of thinking strategically about digital technologies and how to use them to enhance services and connections to the public, developing more streamlined business processes prior to an automation push, establishing a more centralized approach to technology acquisition, and recruiting, training, and retaining digitally competent staff. Fourth, in 2017, TSA's Office of Contracting and Procurement arranged with the Academy for a study that would assess TSA's competitive procurement goals and identify best practices for promoting competitive procurements. In addition to this report, the Academy is currently partnering with the Senior Executive Association and the Shared Services Leadership Coalition to host a monthly working group comprising agency representatives charged with implementing shared services across the executive branch. This effort supports the President's management agenda cross-agency performance goal to deliver shared quality services. While the Academy understands that many procurement decisions are highly decentralized in Congress, there are clear efficiencies to be gained when purchases are made at scale, and operational advantages accrue from standardized requirements for common and integrated IT systems. I would reiterate here that although the Academy has not specifically studied the options for modernizing Congress and its operations, we are an institution chartered by Congress, and as such, Congress could certainly direct such a study. We'd welcome the opportunity to partner with this committee to develop and evaluate options that could lead to recommendations to improve how Congress manages its schedule and procedures, how it recruits and develops its staff, how it executes its administrative processes, and how it procures technology and manages innovation. That concludes my written statement, and I'd be pleased, my oral statement, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you or the committee may have.
Thanks very much for your testimony, and we'll move along to questions, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to start with Mr. Tischinsky. You know, some members prefer the support they get today from the shared finance and shared technology staff that they have. Give me a sense of what you think would happen if the House centralized that type of support.
I think the House always needs good people that understand the institution. I think where somebody sits potentially from an employing authority perspective, that might change, but I think that there's actually an opportunity for financial administrators. They all work independently managing different offices, and I think they have different practices, and there's probably better practices that if you brought them all together that they could actually come up with better and new ways to help offices manage their finances. So I think it's just logistically maybe where they're sitting, but I think a model could be put in place that would allow them to be centralized, but still potentially even the offices have the same resource that provides that service today, continue to do so.
I want to stick on the theme of technology and direct question to Mr. Willison. When we've had member testimony and as we've done outreach to members and to staff, one of the most consistent issues that comes up is just technology challenges in our member district offices. We've experienced this with offices having a very hard time just getting connected. In your experience, do Senate offices run into those problems as well with their state offices lacking technology capabilities? And if you can give any guidance on operationally, are there reforms that we ought to be looking at that might address that?
The Senate absolutely has the same problems. You know, part of our goal in our organization was to be able to provide exactly the same services to staff and people in the state offices as we did in DC. As a practical matter, that's extremely difficult. I think members are probably more satisfied with the availability of technology and working networks and systems that operate well when they're in federal buildings or other governmental buildings where they're in some cases able to slipstream on existing technology and the way the networks are set up. Commercial spaces can be a problem, particularly in rural areas. We have lots of members who have offices in far-flung locales, and some of the same ability to internet services and even telecom is just far more difficult to deal with. I don't have a great answer. From a security standpoint, we always pushed our members to be in federal buildings or in courthouses and places that you all may not always enjoy being, because it provides a big layer of security that is inconvenient between you and your constituents. So it's always a balancing act, but it's a problem.
Finally, Ms. Curtin, when we did a member day, I think one of the more interesting bits of testimony we got was from a freshman member, Dean Phillips, who talked about the use of space. And to the credit of Chair Lofgren and the House Admin Committee, I know it's something that they've been digging into. I understand that you're also doing some ongoing work with the architect of the Capitol, and we've heard a number of members engage on this question of how physical space gets used, and with hope that it can be used in a more efficient way and perhaps in a way that drives more collaboration even. Can you give us a preview of some of your findings, perhaps?
Well, the current work with the architect at the Capitol is really focused on renewal strategies for the Longworth and Rayburn office building. And the report is not yet final, so I know that when it is, the architect will be sharing that with Congress. But certainly as we've looked at renewal strategies, the question about space has come up. So in the context of this current study, we haven't actually looked at that, but we are starting to raise the question and potentially may have the opportunity to follow up on that with the completion of this report.
Any guidance or any takeaways as you look at how space gets used currently in the House? Anything you think any strings you think we ought to be pulling?
I certainly think there are questions around shared committee room space, whether or not you can move to a telework arrangement that allows you to share office space or contract office space so that you have less need for people to be here 5 days a week or more. So those are the principal aspects, and certainly if you centralize the administrative services, that may also reduce the need for space in individual members' offices that could allow you more flexibility in arrangements.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing. I will tell you, I only had to press one button at the bottom of the Cannon Elevator Bank today instead of 2 buttons to get the elevators to come. I credit the chairwoman of the House Administration Committee with that success, but I felt streamlined on my way over here this morning. Tell me about the GSA schedule. Everybody mentioned bulk purchasing. Distinguish in your case, in the Senate, Mr. Wilson, purchasing with Senate-sized purchase orders instead of what all of GSA has negotiated on the schedule?
Obviously, the Senate's a smaller scale. We'd be in probably better shape if the House and Senate can do some joint procurement, because we use the GSA scale as sort of as a guide, but we're not completely bound by it it's just a different animal. What we found is from everything from office supplies to computers to desks and most things, that if you purchase it in bulk, which can be done in the Senate because the centralized contract authority resides within the Sergeant at Arms, so decisions made by the party secretaries or the Secretary of the Senate or committees and others, by bringing them all through a sort of a centralized process, we were able to make similar purchases for similar functions, and it clearly drove prices down. And frankly, it made it a lot easier for members who, at times in the past, had sort of been left on their own for things like My favorite example is copiers, is individual member leases for copiers back years and years ago. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, water was the most interesting thing on the Inspector General's. I hadn't thought about water. I see all the trucks going through security. Yes, if we only had to do one. You listed 3 elements of low-hanging fruit in your testimony. To Dr. Peterson's point, there is a culture of deference to members, and I don't like folks thinking they know better how to serve my constituents than I do. Anything else that you didn't mention in low-hanging fruit, Mr. Brzezinski, that might be a place that we could start to get members comfortable giving up that authority?
I think the technology piece is probably a heavy lift. It's the office's computers, their office's data that's on those devices. One thing that's been talked about a little bit are some of the other ancillary equipment, be it copiers. Televisions is a big one. If you look at member offices, there's probably staffers watching this hearing today from the office on the television. Those are individually purchased by the member office. So each office, one-off purchases. So you've got 400 plus offices that, again, periodically would need to refresh TVs. I think purchasing those in bulk would be an opportunity. Copiers, anything that an office buys, even though there are blanket purchase agreements and other things that have been negotiated, there's still a lot of one-off purchases with Amazon, purchases with various vendors for papers, pencils, and anything else. So I think it's analysis and looking at the spend at the house and where are those opportunities. So like you said, water's one. Is there a reason? Is water different from one vendor to another? Probably not. So I think there are opportunities. It's just, again, being diligent. I think having a central procurement folks that are charged with that.
You all were only tasked with looking at the last decade, but if I go back to 1994, right, we had this conversation and we decided to go in exactly the opposite direction. We had a schedule of computer equipment, but it took so long to get the schedule approved and computers were moving so fast, we went away from that. We had a central printing office, and even in 1995, we said, you know what, there are a lot of other private vendors who can do this work. Why are we keeping this in-house? So many of the suggestions that were made in your testimony related to bringing things back inside, which I would say runs counter to what I would see as a government-wide push to take things outside. Can someone explain that seeming disconnect to me? Ms. Curtin, and I'm looking forward to reading that AOC report that says maybe we should build something new instead of renovating the old. I'm going to be fascinated.
Perhaps, sir. But I think your question about insourcing versus outsourcing is a function of the more broad business technology, right? So as the industry itself, especially the retail industry, has centralized, you now have more common portals for that kind of purchase. And we certainly see across the executive branch a move to shared services, whether it's IT procurement or human capital service delivery or even a centralized grants management approach, because we realize that now sometimes too many choices is actually inefficient and there is value in scale. So I think it's a combination of the change in the retail and buying technology that's out there and a recognition that at the scale that the government operates at, there really is value to some centralization in terms of cost efficiency.
I thank you all for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Lofgren.
As I was just mentioning to the chairman, I'm sure everyone is watching this hearing. It's riveting. But I do think it's important because if we can gain efficiencies here for the taxpayer, that's a good thing. And I think we've made some progress on that already in this Congress, partly with the help of this committee, and also the House Administration Committee has been working collaboratively with this committee to do real-time progress as we go along. And certainly, the Inspector General, you've provided a very valuable service to the House. I'm interested in what further we can do with the Senate, and maybe that's a wishful thinking. But I remember years ago have been from time to time a member of the interparliamentary group with Mexico. And California is a border state, and we alternate years. One year, the Mexican Congress comes to the U.S., the next year we go to Mexico and meet with them. And it's helped, I think, in terms of relations between the two countries. And one year, we had a military jet. The House members got in it and landed in Mexico City. And then we saw another military jet with the Senate. And I thought, couldn't we be in the same jet? We sent two down there. That's kind of a ridiculous example, but there are things in terms of bulk purchases of paper and pens and all the things where you can end up getting a discount. Is it possible to do that, do you think, Mr. Willison, to just come to an agreement between the two bodies to save some money on goods?
Setting aside the institutional prerogatives in the history of the House and Senate, which I realize is difficult to do, there's no reason that things can't be done that way in terms of bulk purchases. Frankly, in terms of stepping a little bit outside of the sergeant-at-arms role, but more into a chief of staff role in terms of information services, like all of the news sources. Obviously, GQ is a big one for everyone.
Subscriptions we could save.
Things like that certainly can be done more centralized.
I think that's something we ought to talk to Senator Blunt about and how we might get that ball rolling. I'm interested in how the Senate pays for their offices in states. You referenced that it's preferable to have district offices in federal buildings for security reasons and the like. The real impediment that I have found just as a member is it's too expensive. We can't afford the dollar per square foot in the federal building. We have something that's, probably 20% of the cost per square foot in our district office. Have you seen the way the Senate has structured that avoidance of cost? I mean, how does it actually work in the Senate side, and is that something we ought to look at? Because if you avoid members avoiding the federal offices because of cost, you're getting other costs for security and some other things that are not factored in.
A couple of responses. I'm not sure ultimately the way the Senate does it is that different than the way you all do it, although I'm not sure. Members have wide discretion and within a budget. I suspect our per member budgets, even taking into account the size of states and other things, are probably a little bit more generous in terms of office space. But yes, if members are going into commercial space, then we offer them a security assessment of the neighborhood, the likelihood of trouble, and sort of the way the office space is laid out. But it does involve an overlay of costs. The sergeant-at-arms absorbs some of that under certain circumstances. Otherwise, it comes out of the representation allowance. It's a balancing act. We do the negotiations for the members, which may be slightly different than the way historically things have been done in the House.
All right.
But by and large, the leases are held by the GSA, the same as they are in the House. It's just
Just a final note on the bulk purchasing of water. One of the things we're looking at is eliminating plastic in the Capitol. So I'm hopeful that we can do bulk buying of water filters rather than plastic bottles of water, but that's for down the line.
Thanks very much. Ms. Brooks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all so very much for being here. I was really pleased to see in the memo from our staff that Mr. Tischinsky, how do you say your name? I'm sorry, I wasn't here when you were introduced.
Tischinsky.
Tischinsky.
Just rolls off the tongue.
Tischinsky, that you are a Lean Sigma black belt.
I am.
And when did you get that esteemed certification?
Probably 2002, maybe?
So I was at our state's community college system prior to coming to Congress, and the manufacturers, Indiana has one of the largest manufacturing economies in the country. Lean Six Sigma, as well as in other sectors of our economy, is incredibly important. And having people with that type of certification produces so many efficiencies in their companies and actually really adds to their bottom line in a significant way. Do you have any idea how many House employees or Senate employees have any certification in Six Sigma?
I have a couple in my office.
Good.
And we've done training with some of the House officer organizations, particularly with the Chief Administrative Officer. We've actually done training in the past with the folks on House administration.
Outstanding.
Staffers. So widespread, I don't think so. I think that there's some individuals that have knowledge and experience in those areas, but it's not as widespread as even in the executive branch.
Do you think if we were to do a bit of education as to what it was, I quite frankly didn't know much about it until I went and worked with manufacturers and really learned about it. Do you think if we were to do that within our own offices and with committees and so forth, that it could, what kind of benefits do you think we might have if we could do some training in it?
I think there's always benefits, and particularly just the lean portion of just getting rid of some of the waste in processes.
Where would you start?
I think getting a champion, at least one individual in an office, if an office wanted to, or a committee wanted to pursue that, getting somebody trained and then kind of being a champion and looking for opportunities within an office. I think every office is probably a little bit different, but there's the people that do the work, they know where their headaches are. But figuring out how to solve them, that's where some of those tools can come in place.
I have to share with my colleagues, I recently visited a headquarters in my district called CAR, K-A-R, and Jim Hallett, the CEO, instituted a practice to only allow one wastebasket in an area. So everyone didn't have a wastebasket by their space, and the amount of paper they are saving is remarkable. And it is a highly technical company, and also the amount of interaction that happens when you have to get up and go and complain, but they have now done it for a couple of years, and it's remarkable. Are you familiar with that practice?
I'm not, but there's some workflow and things can drive behaviors, and you see those kinds of potential benefits.
So it was a very interesting concept. I just saw that. But I do think that Lean Six Sigma could have some incredible benefits. I'm curious, Mr. Peterson, do you think a centralized one-stop shop that actually might advise offices on administrative best practices or efficiency best practices could be helpful? And why or why not?
Well, Congresswoman, as you know, CRS isn't going to say yes or no on a question like that. There are benefits, there are trade-offs. The question is, if you have this centralized office, what do you do to make sure that members use it? And in an organization that traditionally is not in the business of telling members how to run their offices, I think there could be challenges. Are there benefits? Potentially, yes. Are they assured in this institutional environment? That's less clear.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wilson, what are some of the ways that maybe the House and the Senate might work better together? Low-hanging fruit.
The obvious stuff is procurement, things that everybody needs and everybody uses. There are not a whole lot of differences between how you all run your offices and how Senate members do. There are 435 of you. There are only 100 on our side, but the staffing is probably higher in the House. But it's just a matter of accounting and things like that. Obviously, in terms of using administration resources such as planes and military aircraft and things like that, there's not a great reason that members need to be kept separate on things like that. Probably some best practices that can be shared back and forth on human resource related things, education and training, employee assistance, and things of that sort.
Thank you. Thanks. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. Ms. Curtin, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the National Academy of Public Administration report that came out earlier this week that I think was really a great step in the right direction to talk about how we get more science and technology resources and expertise into Congress. Your report pointed out multiple gaps in congressional science and technology support. in the different analytical products that are provided by support agencies, but also committees and personal offices. And so thank you for providing that. It's helpful for us. As someone who spent most of my career in technology prior to my service here, I definitely agree that it's important that Congress catches up with the rest of the country regarding technology expertise, knowledge, and access. A few months ago, this select committee took the first step to tackle these gaps in science and technology support by passing a bipartisan recommendation to reestablish what we call the modernized version of the Office of Technology Assessment with a new and improved mandate. It included studying emerging technology, providing advice to members and staff, and assessments of different approaches to provide technology infrastructure to be used by Congress. And so I wondered if you could share with us, in your opinion, do you think that CRS and GAO fall short currently? And do you think a new and significantly different Office of Technology Assessment could be a path forward to fill the shortfalls that we have today?
Thank you for that question. And we are very pleased to deliver this report. We think it's a very important topic. And we looked at 3 options as we were considering solutions to provide better science and technology support to member offices, to committees. And while we did identify current gaps in what CRS and GAO deliver, we felt that a more solid approach than creating a new Office of Technology Assessment was to reinforce the staff in CRS and GAO, and then to establish a joint office of the Congressional Science and Technology Advisor that would help integrate the work that CRS and GAO provide. So we recommended enhancing CRS to expand its quick turnaround and consultative services. It delivers extraordinary support to members on short-term requests. But given the volume of those requests, we would suggest increasing their resources. That GAO has created a new Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics mission team, and they could also be reinforced to expand the supply gaps, as we sort of call them, around provision of information to members regarding technology assessments and other sort of foresight process. Then this Office of the Congressional Science and Technology Advisor, which would be sort of minimally staffed and partly with experts, but more importantly, in collaboration space, could make sure that the CRS and the GAO products were meeting the needs of members of Congress and could prioritize those requests in ways that individual members may not have leverage to establish priorities with the CRS or the GAO. This office could very much assist with that. We also recommended that it be used to increase what we call the technology absorption capacity of a committee specifically, and could provide expert evaluation in terms of staffing committees so that there's expertise in the committees that would need to be engaged in science and technology. The 4th thing is to create a coordination council amongst those 3 organizations, perhaps with some ombudsman representation from across the committees, to really ensure that there was a solid perspective on the needs of the members for science and technology information, and that the existing resources are best optimized to provide that. We felt that this would be a more efficient and more sustainable approach than creating an Office of Technology Assessment that's very difficult to keep staff and keep current.
I've heard that reviving the Offices of Technology Assessment, some people have described as politically difficult. So when writing your report, were you concerned about it being politically difficult to create such an organization again?
We did focus on both the practical application, or the practical challenges associated with all of these different solutions, less about the political impacts and more just about how one might go about doing it. And so in terms of both feasibility and sustainability, we made the recommendations to reinforce existing organizations because they are already in place, and you could begin to deliver that increased service right now with a little bit of extra funding, and then creating this the counselor sort of office separate from an organization that would provide direct advice or recommendations, we felt was a more achievable option in the short term.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Tischinsky, I wanted to start with you. As a former staffer, I used to work with the CAO in purchasing, making sure that I understood the many processes in and around the house. And I was always amazed when I got here that some things never changed. And I think this committee, in and of itself, is trying to push some of that change that we've been trying to push on the House Administration Committee for a few terms. I have some specific questions. I was going to ask about bulk purchasing, but that seems to have been addressed already by some of my colleagues. Vendors overall, there seems to be a process in place in the House that could feasibly discourage vendors from wanting to work within the House operations, mainly on technology. It seems that we've created a process that has allowed for a couple of companies only to create somewhat of a duopoly within our constituent management software systems. It seems like the approval process for vendors is antiquated and takes too long. What recommendations would you have for us to be able to work with the CAO to get more approved vendors to bring in competition, more up-to-date technology that wouldn't just focus on the technology side, but throughout the House operations? It seems to me that if we have more competition, we'll actually get better products and at a better price. And it doesn't seem like that's a priority for the House at the time. What can we do to fix that?
I think laying out the requirements and what we're actually looking for, making sure that when we go out and look for vendors to provide a particular service, that we're clear on what the requirements are and what the opportunity is, making sure that that information's out there and that you're hitting the right vendors to come in and bid, and also the requirements, making sure that we aren't putting hurdles out there that may not, that aren't critical.
Not critical, maybe outdated?
Could be. I think we've seen in some contracts some of the things that, asking for things that, I think sometimes it warrants the question, do you really need that as part of the contract? Looking beyond the boilerplate language that's there and kind of streamlining some of that, I think there are some opportunities, but it's got to be for vendors to submit bids or to look to do business with the House. They need to understand, number one, what we are looking for, but also what the playing field looks like and what the requirements are. And I don't think we're always clear on that.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you there. Do you think the process as it exists today, is there a streamlined process for vendors to know where to go within the House if they want to participate in working with the House?
I have not seen anything that, if I were playing the role of a vendor coming in and wanting to do business with the institution, I wouldn't know where to start. I'm not sure how clear it is in the marketplace of how to do business. I think people may be familiar with the GSA requirements and how to get on the schedule. That's well-known, publicized, but the House is a different animal, and I don't know, frankly, how clear that is to vendors in the marketplace.
Interesting. I think that's something my colleagues and I need to address. Mr. Willison, from your time over in the Senate, I know we have different dietary requirements in the House and the Senate, of course, but can you give us any advice on what may be working in the Senate in regards to what I just asked Mr. Tischinsky about that we could implement here in the House?
I think the Senate has some of the same challenges. During part of my tenure, we actually went through a process that involved member offices and IT managers and our House Rules Committee, which is the equivalent of your Committee on Administration, to identify requirements and then put out a request for proposals from vendors. And I think we have, when I left, I think we had about 5 doing the constituent services systems work that were sort of on the approved list of everyone who qualified and could do the work. I think part of the problem that in terms of getting more vendors into this space is that and the reason that there have been 2 companies in particular, and they're probably the 2 working within the House, is that if the more members you have, the more money you make, and the more you salami slice it down, it's difficult to make it worthwhile to bid.
I understand that, but I as somebody who's worked with all of those systems, they haven't been updated with new technology, and I think that has a lot to do with the procurement process that we have in the House. And frankly, some of the hurdles that Mr. Tischinsky talked about. If people want to work and want to provide better products, more up-to-date and more efficient products, it seems to me we ought to have a better process in place to allow them to at least try. Right. And that's what I just don't see. And I appreciate all your comments. I'm over my time, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get all four of you involved in this and follow up on some of the questions that have been raised by my colleagues. Actually, Mr. Davis said there's a dietary difference with the Senate. I think there's a real serious difference between the Senate and the House, and it's not, totally their issue, their problem. They just, I think one of it is probably arrogance or something, but they think they're better than we are. But I'm not going to talk about that here publicly. But what I want to talk about is the district office issues. And when I was first elected 14 years ago, we went to the federal courthouse in downtown Kansas City, brand new courthouse. It's about $80,000 a year. Now, people didn't want to come in. And the reason, you got even if you're a law-abiding citizen, when you walk through those doors, you got the FBI, the federal marshals, you got the local police, you got Kojak, the Lone Ranger, Lassie. I mean, all just piled up right there. And so even law-abiding citizens were nervous about coming in. So we moved out and got an office in Midtown, Kansas City. Much cheaper, about $25,000 a year cheaper, and larger. There's a guy serving a 10-year sentence at Leavenworth for throwing 2 firebombs in my office. Thank God they didn't go off. And over the last 2 months, the windows have been broken out. So the landlord, is probably not wanting to extend the lease, which I don't blame him. I mean, he's paying money. And we would rather be in a federal building. But how, is it possible that we could go into, your opinions, all of us, go into federal buildings where the rent that we would pay in a federal building is budgeted for GSA, as opposed to us taking the money out of the MRA to pay exorbitant prices, the government taking money from the government to pay back the government. And the average citizen out there doesn't understand that. What do you think we can do to resolve that, or is that resolvable? Okay, thank you.
I would just say that I think that it is a bit of a, moving it from one pot to the other. I think, maybe through the appropriations process, that could be something that would be worked in or put in the language to allow that. I'm not a lawyer, but that would be kind of the area I would point to, is maybe through that process something could happen. But you're absolutely right. It's moving from one pocket to the other.
Anybody else?
I tend to agree. It's a solvable problem, and it's a bookkeeping problem, but it does bridge the divide between the executive branch and the legislative. It probably would, my guess is it would require some legislation or a change to your rules over here, and probably some directive language to the GSA.
Actually, you probably said something I had not thought about, which is the executive legislative branch issue. I don't even know if that's a constitutional issue. If it would get into. That's. But I think many members would probably move into federal buildings, but we can't afford the government rates.
Things are exactly the same in the Senate.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone would like to do it, but it's complicated and they don't exist in some places. So, and even if everyone is doing everything right in terms of security and hardening your infrastructure and everything, it's still not the same, but it's a trade-off between access to citizens to you all.
Yeah, the Capitol Police has come out to our office. We've done everything that they've said, still having problems, which could be resolved overnight if we move to federal code. Anyway, thank you. You're back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Yes, thank you all for being here today. Mr. Tischinsky, one of the things I was most interested in is your suggestion about centralizing some of the financial administrative support, because as a new member, one of the first things I had to deal with was getting this relatively limited pot of money and wanting to devote it more to constituent and legislative ideas than things like hiring accountants and everything else. Can you talk a little bit about what that could look like, and then particularly your suggestions regarding travel expenses and per diems, which is something we've talked about in other contexts here too?
Yeah, I think the, each member with the MRA is managing a budget. Particularly for a new member coming in here and having to set up an office and figure out what bills you have to pay, and then the process by which bills get paid is understood by a few. So typically, either someone who's worked in that space and has been up here for a while doing that function, or leveraging a shared employee or somebody else to help the office manage the finances, the typical way offices do that. I think in a centralized fashion, I think the CAO does provide some budget support. They provide the systems. Are there opportunities to better invest in technology that would help those offices? I think there probably is. But I think if provided the resources, I think they, almost as your outsourced finance provider, that you just have your bills and say, I need to get these paid, and somebody who, with the knowledge, experience, knows how to get those through the process. So, I know offices have, you're missing a receipt, you don't have this, and the back and forth, that's, inefficiency right there. So, I think providing that kind of support could be beneficial to member offices, but as we talked about, the centralization, decentralization, things ebb and flow like that when you don't deliver on the centralization. So it's making sure you have the resources to provide those services so that the customer, the members, feel the value add. With respect to the per diem, that's I think staff spend an inordinate amount of time having to photocopy receipts. Today, you may not get a receipt if you use Apple Pay. You pay for Starbucks on your app. Somebody's going to have to download a receipt, print it off, make a photocopy. I mean, the amount of time, if I can envision if somebody goes on a 3 or 4 day trip, it may take them 45 minutes to an hour to prepare an expense report. That's where they can be doing casework. They can be focused on other activities. I think there's a better way to do those things. And per diem is one of those things that you don't need receipts. You've set the cap at this is what the, for meals and incidentals, this is what it is. Today there is no cap. This puts a hard cap. It makes it easy to budget. If you were sending a couple staffers to your district office, you know how much they're going to be reimbursed for all that. Makes the budgeting process no surprises, I would say. So
It's interesting. My colleagues have heard me many times compare this to my experience in a large law firm, where shortly before I left, they moved to the online system for submitting travel receipts, et cetera. And as with everything, change took a little bit of time to adjust to, but it also was much more efficient and easier to get things done that way. I guess, Mr. Peterson, Dr. Peterson, we've talked a lot about bulk purchasing, and both from the law firm perspective, we didn't have each of our partners, no matter how large their egos, purchasing their own paper and water. So the bulk purchasing suggestions that we've been talking about here, are we talking about DC, or are we talking about expanding this to district offices? Because I see some, differences in how efficient we can be there.
Most of the proposals aren't sufficiently fleshed out that we know the scope of, to which they, are going to apply. On the other hand, it may be fairly easily to source bulk purchases for a common campus in the District of Columbia, and a lot harder to figure out how to efficiently deliver a case of paper to Media or Manhattan.
Okay. I am interested in that, having seen it both in the law firm context and as a school board member where we had state-operated regional bulk purchasing, which there we had maybe not egos, but sovereignty concerns. But, you know, we were able to manage our budgets better by having some certainty there. So I'd be really interested in seeing what we could do in that context.
Before we adjourn, and I know they're going to call votes in a bit, Mr. Tischinsky, you know, I want to pull on a thread that Mr. Woodall raised, which is there seems to have been historically this, you know, centralization and then decentralizing, and now much of your testimony suggests trying to pull some of those things back in, whether it be purchasing or technology, to Mr. Davis's point. If we were to make recommendations in that space around re-centralization of some of these functions, anything we ought to be cautious of, any unintended consequences we ought to be thinking about?
I think the big thing is if you centralize and there is opportunity to save money, but again, it's also moving it from one hand to the other. You can't just put requirements on, for instance, the chief administrative officer. Now you have to do these things. They need to be resourced to do those. So that would be the number one thing. Make sure that they, whoever the service provider is, that they have the resources to do the job. And again, I think you become their customer, and I think that it's all about delivery at that point in time. Members would vote with their wallets if they weren't getting the services they were provided. That's, I think, historically why things end up being decentralized, is because they're not satisfied with what's provided centrally. So I think there's making sure that the metrics and the oversight folks make sure that they deliver, but they need the resources to provide those services. It doesn't just magically happen.
Do those feedback mechanisms exist right now? I mean, I think a lot about within some of the administrative functions here, whether you could kind of Yelpify them a little bit, because I guess my speculation is that the mothership doesn't always know that the pods aren't happy, you know?
I would agree. I think that there's obtaining feedback. That's how you get better. You know, that's the way I look at things. I think the support organization should be soliciting feedback from members, from the people that they provide service for, and responding to that. Does
that exist now? Does that kind of feedback mechanism, you know, is there interplay within the centralized functions now?
I don't, not to the degree I think that you need. I think there's, again, I know on the technology side, if you put in a service request, they ask for your feedback at the end of those. So I think on a one-on-one, but kind of in aggregate, and for all services, I think that's, the feedback typically, I think, is members will let the members on House admin know what some of the concerns are, and then those are then you know, shared with the provider, be it the officer or whoever. But I think having a dialogue is how you understand where service gaps may exist or opportunities exist. So I think that's cultural, and that's something I think that would do the institution well. And I agree with the Yelpify. That's need to know how you're doing, and people need to be encouraged to provide the feedback.
And Mr. Willison, I'm just curious if there were any reforms that you were thinking about in the Senate before you moved on from the Senate. Any ideas that you were pursuing or that were hanging out there that we ought to be thinking about on this committee?
Not a whole lot. I've got some other examples of things we were working on. You all, years and years ago, privatized your hair care facilities, and we didn't. And we worked over time and with input from members and staff. You'd be amazed at how many people took hair care very seriously to try and figure out ways to ran a deficit most years. how to drive that down with a mix of federal employees that you didn't want to harm, as well as getting some vendors in who more or less rented the chairs. So things like that. There are big undone things regarding security of the complex and security of members in their district offices. We've touched on a bit, and then some end of the world problems that are underway. But and I've tried to stay out of the way of my successors, which is tricky because I took over as the chief of staff and stayed in the institution after I left the sergeant at arms office. I tried not to stay overwhelmingly involved.
Just looking to my colleagues if anyone had any additional questions before we adjourn. Okay.
Let me just thank Mr. Wilson for leaving the Senate.
You're welcome.
Yeah. With that, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response, and I'd ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record, and with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.